Just before news of the Ohio train derailment started penetrating mainstream media, TikToker Nick Drombosky posted this video to the platform explaining the event, which went viral. Let's watch some of that.
So prior to this, the biggest spill of this chemical was in New Jersey, where one train car and about 23,000 gallons of vinyl chloride were spilled, but it didn't catch on fire. Now, this crash in Ohio has 5 train cars. These kinds of tanker cars can carry between 25 and 33,000 gallons. Let's call it 250 to 250,000 pounds of vinyl chloride. That's per train car, 5 train cars. There's maybe 1 million pounds of this toxic chemical spilling into the ground and also boiling off into the air. But then it caught on fire. I think this is where the reporting is really bad, because no one is mentioning what the byproduct of vinyl chloride burning is. Of the many byproducts of burning vinyl chloride, one of them is hydrogen chloride. Hydrogen chloride is really unstable and latches onto water, like just water vapor in the atmosphere, and that turns into hydrochloric acid. So right now, government officials from the railroad, both the governor of Pennsylvania and Ohio, are calling burning off the 1 million pounds of this stuff a success, but not mentioning that it means that we have hundreds of thousands of pounds of acid in the air, potentially.
Reporting from the Lever News revealed the weakening of the high hazard flammable train classification and efforts to kill brake safety rules, since the Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro says he has requested that President Biden and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, quote, re-examine this effort. Here's what the White House had to say on the matter this morning.
Should the Obama-era rail safety braking rule, the better braking technology rule that the last administration knocked out, should that be reinstated?
We're monitoring the situation. I can tell you that the president has been briefed on this and just don't want to get ahead of what's currently happening on the ground or, the reports that we're hearing. But again, I just laid out what the EPA has been doing for about a week. They've been on the ground testing the air quality. They've been talking to locals on the ground, trying to meet their needs at the moment. I just don't want to get ahead of any specifics here because, again, we're monitoring closely.
Entrepreneur and science communicator Nick Drombosky and reporter at The Lever, Rebecca Burns, are both here to discuss. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks for joining us. Nick, I'll start with you. The administration, the government seems to be taking the attitude that they have the situation under control, while people watch this enormous poisonous cloud for however long that was going on. You talked about in your video, the fear potentially that the APA, for instance, might not be checking for the right hazards, given how the chemicals can combine and form a different chemical that might not be, what they're testing for. People in the area have talked about, having fish showing up in the water dead, even at a distance from the site. What are you, warning viewers to be on the lookout for?
Well, first, I just want to say that the video that you guys played is over a week old. So most of that information is outdated or not applicable anymore. At this point, it seems that the main concern is that there was also a major oil spill, and that wasn't disclosed in any of the early stuff. They spilled at least 2 tank cars, which could be up to 60,000 gallons of petroleum oil.
So do you mean to say that the concerns about the spilled chemicals are no longer a concern, or it's just an additional concern?
It's different chemicals. I'm sorry, it's different chemicals. So initially, the big concern that they were talking about was vinyl chloride, because that was kind of the first stage of an emergency, because that vinyl chloride was possibly going to turn into 5 very large bombs. So that was why there was that original explosion. But at this point, most of the byproducts from that should have been dissipated in the atmosphere or possibly settled to the ground in the form of particulates. And that's why soil testing is important, which we've seen none of.
And what are the potential consequences of those particles being either in the air or in the soil in terms of human health, affecting the water table and the like?
Well, one of the big things that we need to push on is in these kinds of disasters, it's very rare for us to get a thorough accounting of what chemicals are involved. And early on, we really didn't. And when they made their original projections for this explosion, people should be asking, were all these chemicals actually accounted for? Because all they were talking about originally was the vinyl chloride and the butyl acrylate.
Rebecca, I want to ask you a little bit more about the political angle of this. The Lever has done such good comprehensive reporting about all of the kind of regulatory choices that led to this moment, including the choice not to require the newer brake system in all of these cars, and of course the ongoing labor discussions we've been having ever since the Biden administration stopped the rail strike at the end of last year about whether or not the staffing issues and the precision railroad scheduling choices also led to this crisis. Tell us a little bit more about what the government could have done and what Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg's transportation secretary should or could be doing in this moment.
Right, thanks for that. So let me start by saying that, the information that was shared initially by Nick via TikTok and that we're finally learning more than a week out now that Norfolk Southern has responded by providing the EPA with a specific list of which chemicals were in which cars. That's all information that should have been provided to state emergency planning officials and first responders. And would have been required to be provided ahead of time had the rulemaking under the Obama administration not restricted the definition of what's known as a high hazard flammable train. So we've all seen the photos of, 100-foot flames rising from the train and the sort of ominous plumes following the controlled release. Despite what that may look like, this train, we learned, was not classified under a high hazard as a high hazard flammable train because of pressure from the nation's main chemical lobby during rulemaking on this issue in 2015. So one issue certainly that could be revisited is just which types of trains and specifically which types of hazardous materials are required to take additional safety measures, including clearing route planning and providing additional notification to state emergency commissions, stricter speed requirements, newer, safer tank cars. So that's one issue that, from what we understand, nothing is stopping the Biden administration and Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg from renewing. So the other issue is this one of the braking systems. And this is something that was also raised to us by some of the rail union groups. And what's important to understand is that most of the nation's freight trains are operating with a braking system that was designed during the Civil War era. So compressed air brakes that stop trains one by one. Now, the railroads themselves, and this is what rail unions pointed us to, were testing newer electronically controlled braking systems in the early 2000s. Norfolk Southern itself, we found a document where in 2007, in one of its newsletters, it was sort of boasting to investors that it had made history by outfitting one of its trains with these new electronically controlled braking systems that radically improve stopping time. So what happened after, again, railroads themselves were testing these braking systems, acknowledging the safety benefits. Rail unions were very supportive of this, again, because of the improved safety benefits. As soon as regulators moved to make this step mandatory, to spend the money to upgrade trains, specifically carrying hazardous materials with newer brakes, that's when we saw the railroads and their chief lobbying group really push back. And from what we understand, the specific concern was that investors were concerned about sort of the short-term impact of these capital expenses. So long-term, initially the railroads thought that this would save them money. It requires fewer inspections, fewer stops. But when there was pushback from investors on sort of the short-term losses or short-term cuts into profits, the railroads pushed back, weakened rulemaking under the Obama administration, and then repealed the braking requirement entirely under the Trump administration.
That's such an interesting perspective because so much of the discussion about regulations versus the industry, it kind of acts as though, there are some people who are more politically on the right, I would say, more libertarian leaning, that say, let the corporations do what they're going to do. They know how to maximize profit. They know how to maximize efficiency, et cetera. But what the narrative that you just laid out is that the railroad experts, basically were kind of positive about the new brake system, thought it would create new efficiencies and safety, but it was the investors in the company, the money men basically at the end of the day, that weren't willing to lay out the short-term expenditures. I think I saw the Lever reported that it would cost about $500 million to implement, which sounds like a lot of money, but of course, back in, I think, 2017, when this was occurring, the profits of these, of Norfolk Railroad in particular was something like $10.5 billion. So completely doable, but the question is, are we willing to have the short-term economic outlay for a long-term benefit? And so often for investors, the answer to that is absolutely not. It's about short-term profit, which of course doesn't inure to the benefit of the company or to the American people. I want to come back to you, though, Nick, for a while, because, I mean, what is so galling and terrifying to people about this is the fact that these are chemicals with big, scary, long names. And we're being told, frankly, the residents of the affected area were told, we didn't test for X and Y chemicals, so you can go back to your homes. And so many people remember, frankly, other incidents like after 9/11 when people were told, first responders were told that the air quality was safe, they could go down and respond to the needs at ground zero without necessarily being concerned about air quality and without having the preventative gear that might have been useful. And then years later, so many people succumb to respiratory illnesses or death as a consequence. So what do you say to people who, don't want to be fear-mongered to, but also want to be cautious about what they should do next in the affected area?
I think it's really tough, and it was really unique watching the first couple of days of this, because having the knowledge of what happened in Paulsboro, where there was a train derailment where they only lost one tanker, those people didn't return back to their homes after the derailment for over a week. So I was expecting that with 5 times more potential of vinyl chloride, these people would be evacuated for at least that same amount of time. The other thing is in Paulsboro, they mandatory tested every single home before anyone could return. So when they announced that they'd be doing voluntary testings and that there was a wait list, but you could return now, it was very odd. But then when you saw that the railroad reopened just hours after they released or ended the evacuation order, people that I talked to in town said they went back to their homes. It was so bad that they had to leave, but they grabbed their pets, they grabbed stuff that they left behind before, but then trains were just going.
And they said, right, that you get tested if you're not feeling well, if you're dizzy, if you have some sight loss, but you don't have to get tested. But then it was almost an acknowledgement that people might be feeling those side effects, which then would undermine whether that it was safe, right?
Yeah. And I think that it's important to recognize that when you look at these, there are a lot of trends. And the one thing that you see is at the beginning, the responsible party, in this case, the railroad, really holds a lot of their info tight. So when we look at how these kind of events get handled in the aftermath and how they get bungled, a lot of it has to just stem with the information flow not coming down as fast and as clear as it should be. I'm sure that if the fire chief, who's the only full-time employee of the city, and the mayor, who's actually a part-time employee, they care about these people. And I think if they had all of the information, I don't think that they would have let their people go back.
Well, Rebecca, let's talk about that, because the profit motive seems to have been driving a lot of the bad decision-making that caused the accident. We played an interview yesterday about someone locally who seemed to suggest that part of the strategy of managing the crash was geared toward opening the rails back up as quickly as possible, as opposed to actually managing the chemical spread and the crisis on the ground most effectively. And now, earlier in the segment, we just saw Karine Jean-Pierre kind of giving, I will say, from my perspective, a kind of subjectively wishy-washy answer about how we're monitoring the situation, et cetera. What we know is that, for example, Joe Biden could have used can continue to use executive authority to give the rail workers the sick days that they were requesting at the end of the last year. There was a conversation about whether or not some of the staffing issues precipitated this crisis. The fact that these 2-mile-long trains are being staffed and inspected by only 2-man crews. In this case, I believe there was a third person who was a trainee conductor on the train. And so, What do you say to folks who perhaps are in the Democratic Party saying, hey, we're doing what we can, we're taking, the decisions are being made for the best interest of the people. From your perspective, what will we be seeing if truly the best interest of the people were being reflected here as opposed to perhaps some political or economic interests?
Right. So we saw, Secretary Buttigieg, who has been coming under criticism for his handling of this incident, and as far as I'm aware, didn't say anything about it until he was pushed to a week later. We saw him on Twitter last night sort of list all of the things that he says he can't do. That's not a very reassuring response to say that we're continuing to monitor the situation. We're continuing to consider whether we can make this rule or that rule. I'm certainly not a rail safety expert, but the specific issues that we've pointed out and found were sort of scrapped in previous rulemaking processes. So again, the definition of a high hazard flammable train and upgrading braking rules. Both of those are something that are widely supported by rail unions. As far as we're aware, nothing is stopping the secretary from revisiting rulemaking on these and other issues that I will say, were being pointed out by rail workers themselves before.
I think I'm just really trying to drive this home because this is what I anticipate happening going forward. The reason that there was so much stress and politicking around the worker sick days was fundamentally because of precision railroading. The idea that the railroads didn't want to give up their ability to have these really tight schedules that got them so much profit over the last 10, 15, 20 years or so. Some of the interventions that would prevent this kind of incident also implicate their ability to do precision railroading. So I wouldn't be surprised if, again, there was a lot of industry pushback against doing the exact kind of rulemaking that we all can see would have prevented this kind of incident, not because it's impossible or even politically non-expeditious, but because those same lobbying efforts that prevented it the first time around have the same incentive to do so. And I'm so grateful to you both for helping us shed light on the contours of this situation. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.